There are moments in life when a single second splits everything into before and after. For Marcus Sullivan, that second arrived on a Thursday morning in San Diego when the screams of a 19-year-old girl tore through his garage and blood pooled on concrete already stained with decades of motor oil. His hands were shaking, covered in crimson that wasn't from any engineering repair, and the voice of the woman in the immaculate white suit cut through the air like broken glass. "Enough. I was wrong to trust you." The girl collapsed, her ankle torn where metal had bitten flesh, and Mark stood frozen as every nightmare from 12 years ago came flooding back. The hospital room, his brother's labored breathing, the promise he'd made and failed to keep. His throat closed around words that might have been an apology or might have been a prayer, but either way, they came out broken. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But before that moment of blood and failure, before the impossible choice that would define everything, there had been a question. A simple question asked by a man nobody paid attention to, in a place where expensive cars never stopped, about something every expert in the world had overlooked. 48 hours earlier, that same garage had been just another Tuesday morning. Mark wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had given up being cleaned sometime during the Clinton administration, squinting at the Cessna engine spread across his workbench like the mechanical heart of something that had once dreamed of flight. The retired pilot who owned it had flown supply runs in Alaska for 30 years and refused to let anyone but Mark touch it. Trust built over time, earned through honesty and work that didn't cut corners even when money was tight, especially when money was tight. Emma sat cross-legged on the garage floor, surrounded by pencils and paper, drawing designs that existed nowhere except in the fevered imagination of a 7-year-old who'd grown up watching her father take broken things and make them whole. Airplanes with too many wings, gears that connected in physically impossible ways, machines that might fly or might just fall apart spectacularly, and either way they were beautiful in their ambition. "Dad, why doesn't this joint rotate smoothly?" She held up a small mechanical puppet Mark had built for her birthday, its arms stuck at an awkward angle. Mark set down his wrench and knelt beside her, his knees protesting the concrete floor the way they always did now that 42 had arrived with its quiet insistence that youth was a foreign country he'd left behind. "Because I haven't lubricated it enough, sweetheart. Machines are like people. When joints get dry, movement hurts." He demonstrated with oil and patience, and Emma watched with the intensity she brought to everything, those dark eyes that were her mother's legacy taking in every detail. Claire had died 7 years ago, minutes after Emma was born, and sometimes Mark looked at his daughter and saw a ghost that smiled back at him with love instead of haunting. The nurses had placed the baby in his arms while doctors worked frantically to save a woman already lost, and Mark had made a choice in that moment. Drop out, come home, raise this child, let every other dream go. The sound that interrupted their small moment of normal was completely wrong for this neighborhood. Not the rattle of old trucks or the industrial whine of the metal fabrication plant 2 blocks over, or the cry of seagulls fighting over garbage behind the fish market. This was the purr of an engine that cost more than most houses, smooth and foreign, as a voice speaking a language nobody here understood. Mark stood, walked to the half-open roll-up door, and stopped. The Rolls-Royce Cullinan sat in front of his garage like a diamond someone had dropped in a coal mine. White paint so pristine it seemed to reject the very air of this working-class block. The vehicle was worth $400,000 if it was worth a penny, and its presence on the street felt like a mistake in the universe's accounting. The rear door opened, and a young woman emerged slowly, carefully, her movements governed by the rigid metal framework that encased her legs from hip to ankle. Long brown hair fell past shoulders that carried themselves with the particular grace of someone who'd learned to make dignity out of limitation. Her face was pale, delicate, marked by the kind of exhaustion that comes from years rather than days. Beside her stepped a woman Mark recognized from business magazines he'd paged through in waiting rooms. Victoria Ashford, CEO of Neurotech Innovations, one of California's biotech giants. Forbes had called her a visionary. Ted had given her a stage, and right now she was scanning his decrepit garage with eyes that calculated the distance between her world and his in fractions of a second. "Sorry to bother you," the words came out polite but distant, the tone of someone accustomed to service appearing when summoned. "My car overheated. Could you take a look?" Mark nodded, wiping his hands on a shirt that had given up trying to look presentable years ago. Of course, let me check. He opened the hood and bent over an engine bay that probably contained more computing power than the Apollo missions. But even as he tried to focus on hoses and coolant levels, his eyes kept drifting toward the young woman. The girl, Sienna he'd learn later, was trying to sit on an old wooden bench outside the garage, and the process was taking longer than it should have. Every small adjustment brought a wince she tried to hide, every shift of weight a negotiation with pain that had long since worn through whatever patience she'd started with. Mark had spent 20 years fixing machines, learning to spot misalignment at a glance, to hear the wrong note in an engine's rhythm before it became catastrophic failure. The same instinct that told him when a bearing was about to seize or a joint was carrying uneven load was screaming at him now. Something was wrong, not with the girl, with what was supposed to help her. During the 15 minutes he spent checking the Rolls-Royce's cooling system, Mark glanced at Sienna 6 times. Each time she was moving, trying to find a position that hurt less, and each time the braces locked around her legs prevented even that small mercy. He couldn't stay quiet. Mark walked over and knelt at eye level, not looking down the way so many people did with the disabled. That unconscious geometry of pity. Excuse me, I don't mean any disrespect, but your brace, could it be too tight? Sienna blinked, something like shock passing across her face. Nobody had ever asked her that. People stared or looked away or smothered her in sympathy that felt like drowning. But nobody had ever asked if the device designed to help her was actually hurting her instead. How, how did you know? I'm not a doctor, but I'm a mechanic. I can tell when something doesn't fit right. And this brace, it doesn't allow you to move naturally. Victoria Ashford stood up so fast it was almost violent, eyes sharp with alarm and something deeper. Anger, maybe, or fear that she'd been wrong about something she'd trusted completely. What are you saying? That's a top-of-the-line medical device from Medicor, the world's leading orthopedic company. Mark didn't argue. May I take a closer look? Just look. I promise I won't touch anything without permission. Sienna glanced at her mother and nodded. Tori's jaw tightened, but she gave a single sharp nod of consent. Mark knelt again and asked permission with his eyes before his hands touched the brace. His fingers traced the metal joints, testing angles, checking how the structure responded to gentle pressure. His expression grew serious. This knee joint is fixed at a 15-degree angle, but when a person walks naturally, the knee needs a range from 0 to 70 degrees. Because the joint is locked, every step you take forces your hip to rotate about 20 degrees extra to compensate. He looked up at Sienna. That's why you have chronic lower back pain, right? Her mouth fell open. How do you know my back hurts? You're leaning 7 degrees to the right. Your spine is adjusting to reduce pressure. How long has this been happening? 5 years. Tears were forming now, sliding down cheeks that had learned not to show weakness in public. The doctor said it was a normal side effect. I thought I had to endure it. Tori stood frozen. She'd paid $180,000. She'd trusted minds from MIT, engineers who'd built systems for NASA, specialists who published in journals she couldn't even pronounce. And now a mechanic in an oil-stained shirt had identified in 3 minutes what none of them had mentioned across 11 years of consultations. So you're saying, her voice shook despite every effort to keep it steady, it was designed wrong? Mark let out a quiet sigh. Not exactly wrong. They designed it for technology, for sensors, for appearance, but they forgot the most basic thing. He looked at Sienna. They forgot how the human body actually moves. Sienna gathered courage that felt like it might break her. Can you fix it? Mark looked into her eyes and saw his brother, saw the promise he'd made in a hospital room 12 years ago, saw a hope so fragile it might shatter if he said the wrong word. I don't know, but I can try. Before that moment could arrive, before Mark could make promises he wasn't sure he could keep, there was a past that explained why a mechanic knew anything about medical devices in the first place. Ryan Sullivan had been 11 years younger than Mark, born during a brief window when their parents had believed things might get better. He'd been brilliant the way some people are tall, something that just was rather than something earned. Aerospace engineering at UC San Diego, scholarship and grades that opened doors Mark had only dreamed about. The two brothers used to sit on their roof watching planes take off from Lindbergh Field, sketching impossible designs for jets that existed only in their shared imagination. Ryan had loved the ocean the way some men love women or God, with a completeness that left no room for doubt. Weekend diving trips to La Jolla Cove, free diving competitions that tested how deep a human could go on a single breath. He was fearless in the water, and that fearlessness killed him. The accident happened on a Saturday afternoon when Ryan was 24 and the world seemed to hold nothing but possibility. Diving too deep, too fast, too confident in his own abilities. The violent collision with submerged rocks. The sudden understanding that the human spine is delicate in ways that youth refuses to believe. T6 spinal cord injury. Paralysis from the chest down. Mark had been 31 when he got the call from the hospital, standing in the nursery he'd just finished painting. Infant Emma asleep in a bassinet nearby. His wife had been dead for 2 months. His savings were gone. He was working 3 jobs to keep the garage running and food on the table, and now his baby brother needed him in ways that made everything else seem small. The doctors proposed an experimental surgery, advanced nerve reconstruction that might restore some function. The cost was $350,000, a number so large it stopped meaning anything concrete and became instead a measure of how inadequate Mark's love turned out to be. He borrowed from everyone who'd take his calls, maxed out credit cards that charged interest rates that should have been illegal, worked night shifts at the port unloading containers until his hands bled, begged his way through every bank in San Diego, hat literally in hand, pride abandoned in pursuit of a miracle that cost more than some people's houses. It was never enough. Ryan told him to stop from a hospital bed that had become his prison. The words came out steady despite the pain medication that made his eyes glassy. "You have Emma to take care of. I'll be fine, brother. I'll be okay." That brave smile. Mark knew he'd carry it until his own dying day. 5 years later, pulmonary complications took what the accident had left behind. Ryan died at 29 in a room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams, and his last words were a command disguised as a request. "Promise me, if you ever get the chance, help people like me. Don't let them lose hope the way I did." Mark had promised. What else could he do? Refuse a dying man's final wish? But promises made at bedsides and promises kept in the harsh light of ordinary days are different creatures entirely. After Ryan died, Mark began studying. Not the way students study, working toward a degree that would open doors. He studied the way a man builds a cathedral, knowing he'll never see it finished but building anyway. Every night after Emma fell asleep, he returned to the garage with textbooks bought from used bookstores and videos streamed from universities that would never accept him as a student. Biomechanics, orthopedic engineering, the mathematics of weight distribution across joints that evolved to walk upright but sometimes failed at that basic task. He had no medical degree, no credentials, no right by any standard the world recognized to believe he could design anything that would help anyone. But he had the hands of a gifted mechanic and a promise to a brother who was gone, and sometimes that has to be enough. The small garage became a laboratory after midnight, filled with sketches and calculations and the quiet desperation of a man who'd failed once and couldn't bear to fail again. Mrs. Rosa Martinez, the 70-year-old neighbor who'd known Ryan since he was a boy stealing apples from her tree, found Mark asleep at his workbench one morning, surrounded by papers covered in diagrams of artificial joints. "Mijo, you need to sleep." Mark looked up with eyes that hadn't seen rest in days. "I needed to keep the promise, Mrs. Martinez. Ryan wouldn't want you to destroy yourself." But Mark couldn't stop. The guilt was a living thing that ate at him in quiet moments, whispering that he hadn't been strong enough, smart enough, wealthy enough to save the person who'd mattered most. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in a mansion overlooking the Pacific, another person was drowning in guilt of a different flavor. Victoria Ashford stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, watching moonlight shatter across water, and the ocean she'd once loved now felt like an enemy that had stolen everything. She was 38 years old, CEO of a company worth $3 billion, featured on the cover of Fortune magazine beneath the headline, "The Future of Medicine." But none of that could buy back the single moment 11 years ago when she looked at her phone instead of her daughter. The accident had been so ordinary in its beginnings. An August evening at Pacific Beach, the kind of perfect California sunset that made people forget the world contained tragedy. Sienna had been 8 years old, learning to surf, small but fearless on a board almost too big for her to carry. She called out from the water, "Mom, look at me!" And Tori had waved without looking up, fingers still typing an email about a merger that would make her very rich, but was already forgotten by the time the ambulance arrived. The wave that hit had been larger than usual, unexpected, and the surfboard had struck Sienna's head with force enough to fracture her skull and damage the delicate cord that carried messages from brain to body. Traumatic brain injury, incomplete cervical spinal cord damage, emergency surgery lasting 14 hours. Sienna survived, but the person who emerged from that operating room was different in ways that numbers couldn't measure. The incomplete spinal cord injury left her with some sensation, some muscle control, but not enough. Never enough. Weakness from the waist down that made standing exhausting and walking impossible without support. Pain that came in waves, sharp and constant. A reminder that the body was a machine that sometimes broke in ways no amount of money could fix. Tori remembered the first time Sienna woke after the surgery and tried to move her legs. The confusion in her daughter's eyes. Then fear. Then the question that Sienna didn't ask but Tori heard anyway in the silence that followed. Where were you when I needed you? For 11 years, Tori had done the only thing she knew. She threw money at the problem the way some people throw punches. Desperate and increasingly wild. $2 million across specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, Switzerland, Japan. 11 surgeries, each one carrying the promise that this time would be different. This time would be the miracle. Dozens of experimental therapies, cutting-edge devices, treatments so advanced they didn't have names yet. The current brace had cost $180,000, designed by a team from MIT. Titanium alloy framework with AI sensors that adjusted pressure in real time. On paper, it was a technological marvel. In practice, Sienna still couldn't walk, still needed a wheelchair for anything beyond a few painful steps, still woke in the night crying from muscle spasms the miracle device couldn't prevent. Tori knew her daughter tried to hide it. Sienna never complained, always smiled, always said she was fine when she clearly wasn't. But a mother knows. A mother hears the muffled sobs through a half-closed door at 2 in the morning. A mother sees the way her child's eyes go distant when other girls post videos of themselves dancing, running, doing all the thoughtless movement that healthy bodies take for granted. And the worst part was the guilt that lived between them, like a third person at every dinner table, every doctor's appointment, every moment when Tori caught her daughter watching her with eyes that asked a question neither of them could voice. That Thursday morning, after the Rolls-Royce broke down on Interstate 5 and GPS directed them to a garage that looked abandoned, Tori had wanted to refuse, wanted to call her personal mechanic, wait in air-conditioned comfort for someone appropriate to arrive. But Sienna had been shifting in pain the whole drive, and the prospect of waiting another hour seemed cruel. So they'd gone in. And the mechanic had seen in minutes what 11 years of expertise had missed. That night, Tori stood in her daughter's doorway watching Sienna sleep, the brace lying on the floor like some medieval torture device someone had forgotten to throw away. Her daughter was 19 years old, should have been at college, falling in love, making mistakes that mattered only in the small universe of youth. Instead, she was here, trapped in a body that refused to cooperate and a life that had narrowed to the width of a wheelchair. Tori's phone buzzed, an email about quarterly earnings, another about a board meeting. The machinery of success that had consumed her attention the day Sienna fell was still demanding its tribute, still insisting that power and money mattered more than the small voice of a child calling from the water. She deleted the emails and sat on the edge of Sienna's bed. Her daughter's eyes opened. "Mom, you're not asleep yet? I was thinking about the mechanic today." Sienna pulled herself up, wincing at the movement. "You don't trust him, do you?" Tori's throat closed around words that wanted to be honest but weren't sure how. "It's not that I don't trust him. I'm afraid if he's wrong, you'll be hurt worse than you already are. I'll still be the same as I am now." Sienna's voice carried a calmness that seemed wrong for 19, the forced maturity of someone who'd grown up too fast in all the wrong ways. "Mom, I've lived like this for 11 years. I've had 11 surgeries. I've tried everything money can buy, and I still hurt." I still can't walk. I still feel like I'm a burden. You are not a burden. The words came out fierce, but they both knew the truth was more complicated than that. But I feel like one. Tears now sliding down cheeks that had learned to cry quietly. Every time you look at me, I see guilt in your eyes. You keep trying to buy me a miracle. But miracles aren't something you can purchase, Mom. Tori knelt beside the bed and pulled her daughter close and for the first time in years, allowed herself to break down in front of the person she'd hurt most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not looking up. I'm sorry for choosing work over you. I'm sorry for failing you when you needed me. Sienna wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. Stop apologizing, Mom. Let me try this time. Not because of money, not because of famous doctors, just because there's someone who truly wants to help me. The next morning, Tori called Mark before she could talk herself out of it. Her voice trembled despite years of practice at boardroom composure. Mr. Sullivan, I want you to try, but on one condition. Yes, please. If there is any sign of danger, even the smallest, I will stop immediately. I cannot risk my daughter, I understand, and I don't want to hurt her either. I promise I'll be absolutely careful. Fine, but I will be there every step, every decision. Yes, ma'am, I just need you to trust me one chance. For the first time in 11 years, Victoria Ashford, a woman who'd built an empire on controlling outcomes, chose to let go, chose to place faith in a stranger not because of his credentials, but because in his eyes she'd seen something money couldn't fake, genuine kindness. The morning after Tori and Sienna left, Mark carried the brace back into the garage as if he were handling something sacred. He placed it on the old workbench, wiping away every speck of dust, treating each scratch like it mattered. Emma sat beside him, watching her father with the intensity she brought to everything. Dad, are you going to fix this so she can walk? Mark stopped what he was doing. I'm going to try, sweetheart. Emma was quiet for a moment, like when you wanted to help Uncle Ryan. Mark looked at his daughter, eyes darkening, then nodded. Yes, like that. From that moment on, Mark began to dismantle the brace, the rigid metal joints, the straps that distributed pressure incorrectly, an expensive AI sensor system that was nearly meaningless once an actual human body started moving. He redrew the entire design, calculated every angle, compared it to how a normal person walks, how the knee bends, how the hip rotates, how the ankle pushes force forward. The first night passed without him noticing. When faint morning light crept into the garage, Mark was still sitting there, a technical pen in his hand. Emma woke and found her father slumped asleep at the workbench. The next day, the first prototype was born. Mark cut the weight by nearly half, increased the knee's range of motion, added special padding at the contact points where metal met flesh. When Sienna returned with Tori, the atmosphere in the garage felt charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. Dr. James Henderson came with them, at Tori's insistence. Tall, gray-haired, with the particular arrogance of someone who'd spent 30 years being right about complicated things. He looked at Mark the way a professor might look at a student who'd handed in work copied from Wikipedia. You're a mechanic, correct? Yes, sir, and you think you can do what a team from MIT and I could not? Mark didn't argue. I just want to help. Henderson's expression suggested he'd heard that before. I hope you know what you're doing, because if Miss Sienna is injured again, you'll be facing a very serious lawsuit. Mark nodded. I understand. Are you ready? Mark asked Sienna, and his voice carried none of the confidence Henderson's had. I'm ready. The new brace was fitted. Sienna stood. For the first few seconds, she smiled. It really was lighter, really was easier to breathe. The first step went fine. The second step went fine. The third step brought a scream that tore through the garage like something alive. Sienna collapsed. Blood streamed from her ankle where the metal joint had cut into skin with the precision of a blade. Tori screamed and rushed forward, pulling her daughter into her arms with a desperation that spoke of nightmares finally manifesting. That's enough, Mr. Sullivan. Enough. I was wrong to trust you. Mark stood frozen. His hands trembled, covered in blood that looked black under the fluorescent lights. In his mind, the image of Ryan on the hospital bed came flooding back. The same unbearable helplessness. The same understanding that wanting to help and being able to help were different universes entirely. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Tori helped Sienna into the car without another word. But just before the door closed, Sienna turned back. Through her tears, she whispered something Mark barely heard. Don't give up. The door slammed. The Rolls-Royce drove away, leaving silence and the smell of blood. That night, the garage sank into darkness. The broken brace lay motionless on the table, Sienna's blood not yet wiped away. Mark sat alone on the cold concrete floor, back against the wall, phone in his hand. He was about to call Tori to give up, to admit defeat, to finally acknowledge what the world had been trying to tell him, that some things couldn't be fixed by good intentions and borrowed knowledge. His fingers trembled over the screen. Then Emma's voice came from the doorway, small and clear in the darkness. Dad? Mark looked up at his daughter, this 7-year-old who'd already lost more than most children her age could comprehend. I saw you crying. Mark turned his face away. I hurt someone, sweetheart. I thought I could help, but I only caused pain. Emma was silent for a long time. Then she asked softly the question that would change everything. Did Uncle Ryan ever tell you to give up? Mark felt like he stopped breathing. I remember Uncle saying you should never give up on people who need help. Right, Dad? He pulled his daughter into his arms and broke down. You remember so well. Then don't give up. Sister Sienna still believes in you. At that moment, Mark's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Mr. Sullivan, this is Maya's mommy typing for her. Maya wants to say, I'm sorry about mommy yelling today. I'm okay. Please don't give up on me. I believe in you. Sienna Mark stared at the screen. Tears fell, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of determination. The kind that come when giving up stops being an option. He stood, switched the lights back on in the garage, reopened the design plans with hands that no longer shook. Emma stood beside him. Dad will do it again? Mark's voice was steady now. Yes. This time Dad has to succeed. Outside, the San Diego night wrapped around the garage like a promise or a threat, and somewhere in the darkness between those two things, a miracle waited to be born through failure, blood, and the stubborn refusal of ordinary people to accept that some things are impossible. Mrs. Rosa Martinez found Mark at dawn, still hunched over the workbench where failure had left him stranded. She carried a thermos of coffee and a paper bag that smelled of her kitchen, pushing through the half-open garage door without asking permission, because neighbors who'd known you 20 years didn't need to ask. Mijo, you haven't eaten since yesterday. Mark didn't look up from the brace components spread before him like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Not hungry. Rosa set the bag down anyway and poured coffee into a chipped mug that had belonged to Mark's father. She'd been there the day they'd buried the old man, heart attack at 53, and she'd been there when Claire died, and when Ryan stopped breathing in that sterile hospital room. She knew the particular shape of Mark's grief, how it turned inward and became a weapon he used on himself. That little girl sent you a message last night. Mark's hands stilled. How do you know? Emma told me. Rosa's voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried 2. She believes in you, Mark. The girl believes even after you hurt her. You understand what that means? It means I have another chance to fail. Rosa reached across the workbench and gripped his wrist with fingers strengthened by decades of manual labor. No, mijo. It means you have a chance to keep the promise you made to Ryan. And if you give up now, you betray both of them. The words hit harder than any accusation. Mark looked at the blood-stained padding from the failed brace, at the technical drawings that had seemed so promising yesterday, at the gap between what he'd imagined and what his hands had produced. I don't know if I can do this, Mrs. Martinez. Ryan didn't know if he could get into UC San Diego, but he tried. And you're his brother. You don't get to quit just because it's hard. She left the food and walked out, and Mark sat alone with the weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could carry. But Emma's question from the night before kept circling in his mind, a bird that wouldn't land. Did Uncle Ryan ever tell you to give up? The answer was no. The answer had always been no, even when saying yes would have been easier, kinder, more reasonable. Ryan had kept fighting until his body gave out, and Mark had promised to carry that fight forward. Breaking that promise because of blood and failure wasn't an option his brother would have recognized. Mark pulled out his phone and opened the message from Sienna again, reading it 3 times to make sure the words hadn't changed. Then he stood, swept the failed components into a box he'd deal with later, and began again. The week that followed taught Mark things about himself he'd never wanted to know. How little sleep a human body actually needed when guilt provided enough fuel. How many times a design could be torn apart and rebuilt before the paper itself started to disintegrate. How a 7-year-old girl could become the only thing standing between a man and complete collapse. Emma brought him food 3 times a day, heating up whatever Mrs. Martinez had left and carrying it on plates that wobbled in her small hands. She sat with him during the long silences when his mind was too tangled to speak, drawing pictures of machines that didn't exist while her father tried to build one that might actually work. "Are you tired, Dad?" Mark looked up from calculations that had consumed 6 hours without his noticing. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I just need to finish this." But his eyes told a different story, rimmed red from too many nights where sunrise arrived before sleep. His hands shook when he picked up tools, not from age but from exhaustion that had soaked into his bones like oil into wood. Emma set down her pencil. "You need to rest, Dad. Uncle Ryan wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Mark felt something break loose in his chest. Your uncle kept going even when the doctors said to stop, even when every day brought new pain. He never gave up, and neither can I. The child looked at him with Claire's eyes, seeing through to the truth beneath. But Uncle Ryan had people helping him. "You're trying to do everything alone." She was right, and the knowledge stung worse than exhaustion. Mark had always worked alone, trusted himself more than anyone else because trusting others meant depending on them, and dependence was just another word for vulnerability. But maybe that isolation was exactly what kept failing. The belief that one person could shoulder everything if they just worked hard enough. The breakthrough came 3 days later, triggered by innocence. Emma was drawing ballet dancers in her notebook, the kind of graceful figures that existed only in a child's imagination of what dance looked like. She chewed on her pencil, then turned to Mark with a question that had nothing to do with orthopedics and everything to do with the way children notice things adults miss. "Dad, why do ballerinas stand on their toes but we walk on our heels?" Mark's hand froze halfway through tightening a bolt. "What did you say?" "Ballerinas stand on toes. We walk heel first. Different balance points, right?" The wrench clattered onto the concrete floor. Emma jumped at the sound. "Dad, did I say something wrong?" Mark grabbed his daughter's shoulders, eyes suddenly bright with something between revelation and mania. "You said something exactly right, balance points. Different balance points depending on what you're trying to do." He released Emma and lunged for his drawings, spreading them across every available surface. The original Metacore brace, his first failed attempt. Every calculation he'd made about weight distribution and joint and angles. They had all focused on the knee as the primary load-bearing structure, the place where support needed to be strongest. But Emma's question had cracked open a different possibility. The problem isn't the joint. It isn't the weight, it's the center of balance. Mark started sketching furiously, speaking half to himself and half to Emma because teaching her helped him think. When a ballerina stands on her toes, her center of balance shifts to the ball of the foot. When we walk normal, it's at the heel on strike and moves forward through the step. But for someone with weak core muscles from spinal injury, the balance point needs to be higher. He drew a quick diagram of the human body, marking the pelvis. At the hip. The center has to be at the hip. Everything he'd designed, everything Metacore had designed, placed structural support at the knee because that's where engineering said the load was greatest. But human movement wasn't just about load. It was about balance, momentum, the subtle shifts that happened before muscles even fired. For Sienna, with her incomplete spinal injury leaving core muscles weak, the hip was everything. If the brace locked her knee and forced rotation at the hip, she was fighting against the device every single step. But if the center of balance shifted to the hip itself, if the brace supported at the pelvis and allowed natural knee movement, then the body could do what it was designed to do. Mark felt something he hadn't felt since Claire died. Absolute certainty that he was right about something that mattered. "Ryan, I see it now. I finally see it." Emma watched her father transform, the exhaustion falling away as purpose took its place. "What do you need, Dad?" Mark pulled out an envelope from his desk drawer, the one marked, "Emma, Private School Fund." Inside was $3,000, saved over 2 years from repairs that paid better than most, set aside for a future where his daughter could escape this neighborhood and its limitations. He looked at the money, then at Emma, then at the half-finished brace on his workbench. That's my school money. Emma's voice was small but not uncertain. I can't use this. It's for your future. But Emma stepped forward and put her hand on top of his. Use it, Dad. That girl can't wait for me to go to fancy school. She needs to walk now. You sure, sweetheart? I'm sure. Emma's face held the kind of certainty that made 42-year-old men feel small and unworthy. We can save more money, but we can't give her more years stuck in that wheelchair. Mark pulled his daughter into his arms and held her while tears he'd been holding back for days finally broke through. You're braver than me, you know that? I'm your daughter. I'm supposed to be brave like you. The work that followed consumed every hour. Mark spent the $3,000 on materials he'd been avoiding because of cost. Aircraft-grade aluminum alloy lighter than anything Medicor had used. Medical-grade silicone that wouldn't irritate skin. Custom shock-absorbing springs so small they had to be ordered from a specialty manufacturer in Nevada. He worked through the night and into the next day, stopping only when Emma physically put food in front of him and refused to leave until he ate. The neighbors whispered. Mrs. Martinez defended him to anyone who'd listen, but even she worried when she saw him testing the brace on himself at 2 in the morning, strapping it to his own legs, and walking the length of the garage over and over, falling when balance failed and getting up to adjust the design. That boy's gone crazy, someone muttered at the corner store. That boy is saving a life, Mrs. Martinez snapped back. Leave him alone. On the 7th day, Mark installed the final piece, a custom hip joint with a dynamic balance system that distributed weight based on movement rather than static load. The new brace looked nothing like what had come before. Sleeker, lighter, with joints that moved through their full range. He'd shifted the center of balance completely to the hips, creating a structure that supported without constraining, that helped without controlling. Mark stood in the garage holding the finished brace, hands trembling, not from exhaustion now, but from hope that felt dangerous to acknowledge. Ryan, I've finished it. He closed his eyes. I hope this time I won't fail again. The phone call to Tori took 20 minutes of staring at her number before courage arrived. When she finally answered, her voice carried the careful distance of someone who'd been hurt and wasn't ready to risk it again. Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Ashford, I've finished it. The words rushed out before doubt could stop them. I know you no longer trust me, but I'm asking for one last chance. Just this once. If I fail, I won't trouble you again. I promise. The silence stretched long enough that Mark thought she'd hung up. Then Tori's voice came back, careful and controlled. Do you know, Mr. Sullivan, my lawyer is preparing a lawsuit against you? Twice. Twice my daughter was injured because of you. Mark's throat tightened. I know, and I'm sorry, but I also know something else. He paused, gathering courage from Emma watching him from across the garage. Sienna still believes in me. I receive messages from her every day. She asks if I've given up. Tori let out a laugh that held no joy. That's why I've gone crazy. My 19-year-old daughter is placing her entire life in the hands of a stranger. And I, a mother, am considering letting that happen. You're a good mother. You're just trying to protect your child. No. Tori's voice cracked, and Mark heard something he hadn't expected. Tears from a woman who'd probably spent years perfecting the art of not crying. A good mother wouldn't have been looking at her phone 11 years ago. A good mother would have seen her daughter when she called out. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Mark understood suddenly that they were both carrying the same weight, the unbearable burden of having failed someone who needed them, of living in the permanent aftermath of one wrong choice. Mrs. Ashford, for 11 years you've tried to buy forgiveness with money. But maybe forgiveness isn't something you purchase. Maybe it's something you earn by being brave enough to trust again. More silence. Then Tori's voice came back steadier. Tomorrow morning. But Dr. Henderson will be there. And if anything goes wrong, I mean anything, I will stop immediately and you'll never see us again. I understand, and I accept those terms. After hanging up, Mark sat with his head in his hands, feeling the weight of what was coming. Emma climbed into his lap, too big for it really, but neither of them cared about proper boundaries when the world felt like it might collapse. Are you scared, Dad? Terrified. What if it doesn't work? Then I'll have tried my best. That's all Uncle Ryan would ask. Emma wrapped her arms around his neck. I believe in you, Dad. Even if it doesn't work, I'll still believe you tried. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline California sunshine that felt like a mockery or a blessing depending on which side of hope you stood on. Mark had been awake since 4, checking every joint, every strap, every point where metal might meet flesh and cause the kind of damage that ended in blood and recrimination. The sound of the Rolls-Royce engine at 9 o'clock sharp made his heart hammer against his ribs. Emma squeezed his hand. "You can do this, Dad." Mark wasn't sure about that, but he was sure about trying, and sometimes that has to be enough. Tori emerged from the car first, followed by Sienna moving carefully with the old brace that had proven so inadequate. But there was a third person, Dr. Henderson, tall and disapproving, carrying himself with the authority of someone whose opinion had never been questioned in professional settings. Henderson examined the new brace with the kind of attention that found fault before even looking. His brows furrowed. This center of balance system doesn't follow medical standards. Mark met his eyes steadily. But it follows mechanical principles. And humans move according to mechanics, not textbooks. Henderson's expression suggested he'd heard that kind of arrogance before, usually right before disaster. "Mr. Sullivan, if this works, do you understand what it means?" "It means she can walk." "No." Henderson shook his head slowly. "It means you will change an entire field of medicine. And there will be many people who won't like that." Mark hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered that success might bring its own complications. "I don't care whether they like it or not. I only care about her." Something shifted in Henderson's expression. Not quite respect, but perhaps recognition that Mark's motives were cleaner than the politics Henderson navigated daily. For the first time in many years, he found himself hoping to witness something that would prove him wrong about the limits of possibility. Sienna spoke up then, her voice carrying across the garage with surprising strength. "Dr. Henderson, I want to try it. Please." Henderson looked at the young woman, at the hope in her face that 11 years of disappointment hadn't quite extinguished. He nodded slowly. "All right, but I'll be watching." And at the first sign of danger, we stop. The entire garage fell into a silence that felt both empty and full, the kind of quiet where every heartbeat became audible. Mark knelt before Sienna, lifting the new brace with hands that had steadied despite everything. "Are you ready?" "I'm ready." Sienna's hand found her mother's and gripped tight enough to leave Mark's. Mark began fitting the brace with movement. So slow and gentle they bordered on ceremonial. He checked every strap, every joint, every point of contact as if a single misalignment could shatter whatever miracle they were attempting to birth. "How does it feel?" "Light," Sienna's voice carried wonder, "much lighter." Mark stood and extended his hand, then pulled it back halfway. "I won't hold you. I'll only be here if you need me. But you have to stand on your own. Is that okay?" Sienna took a breath deep enough to hurt, then slowly pushed herself upright. The first second passed. Her body didn't shake. The second, still standing. The third second brought a realization that stopped time. "Mom," Sienna's voice trembled. I don't hurt." Tori's hand flew to cover her mouth. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Henderson leaned forward, professional detachment giving way to genuine interest as he studied how Sienna's body responded to the brace. "It's not that the pain is reduced," Sienna spoke slowly, as if saying the words too loudly might break the spell. "There is no pain. For the first time in 11 years, I feel no pain." Mark's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Let your body trust the support. The brace will carry the weight. You just need to move." Sienna nodded, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her right foot, tried to move her toes. No sensation, the permanent damage that no brace could fix. But the brace responded to her weight shift, moving smoothly, naturally, the way human joints were designed to move before injury stole that ability. The first step. Her foot touched ground without the stabbing agony that had marked every step for years. Her knee bent, 20 degrees, 30, 40, smoothly like a person who'd never known paralysis. No fighting against locked joints, no forced compensation through the hip, just movement the way it was supposed to be. "Mom, Sienna's voice broke. "I'm walking." The second step came easier. Her left foot, the weight shift, the hip rotating naturally without that 20-degree over-rotation that had caused years of back pain. The brace distributed pressure evenly, supporting without constraining, helping without controlling. Sienna couldn't hold back the sheaves that tore through her chest, but she kept walking. One step, two, three, four. Each one steadier than the last, each one proving that the human body could heal if given the right support. Mom, Mom, I'm walking. I'm really walking. Tori collapsed onto the garage floor, hands shaking violently as they covered her face. 11 years of guilt, of trying to buy back one moment of inattention, of believing money could solve what only human ingenuity and stubborn faith could address. The sobs that came from her were the kind that lived deep in the chest, waiting for permission to escape. Sienna kept moving. 5 steps, 6, 7. She turned to look at Mark, face soaked with tears but glowing with something that transcended simple happiness. You did it. Mark stood gripping the edge of the workbench, unable to speak. Tears carved lines through the perpetual layer of grease on his face. In that moment he saw Ryan, saw his brother smile, heard his voice making Mark promise to help people like him. This time he hadn't failed. Henderson stood frozen, mouth slightly open. He stepped forward, examining how Sienna moved, studying joint angles and weight distribution with the fascination of someone watching their entire understanding of a field shift in real time. Unbelievable. The word came out hushed. This center of balance system, it's genius. But nobody heard him because Sienna was moving faster now. Not quite running, but close enough that the distinction didn't matter. She moved toward her mother, arms opening wide, and for the first time in 11 years they embraced while both were standing. Not with one in a wheelchair, not with mechanical assistance forcing an awkward angle, but standing together as equals in height and hope. I'm sorry, Mom, the words came muffled against Tori's shoulder. Stop apologizing. You have nothing to be sorry for. They turned together to face Mark, who stood alone with his oil-stained clothes and bleeding hands, in the particular exhaustion of someone who'd poured everything into a cause and somehow, impossibly, succeeded. Tori walked over and wrapped her arms around him without hesitation or calculation. The embrace of someone who'd learned that gratitude transcends class boundaries and social expectations. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up. Mark nodded, voice breaking around words that wanted to be eloquent but came out simple. I promised my brother I would never give up on people who need help. Emma ran into the garage then, clapping and cheering with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd watched her father attempt the impossible and somehow achieve it. She can walk. Dad did it. Sienna knelt, actually knelt, joints bending the way they were supposed to, and pulled Emma into a hug. You have an incredible father. Outside the garage, neighbors had gathered in a crowd drawn by the sound of celebration. Some clapped, some cried, all of them witnessing the birth of something that would ripple far beyond this moment. Mr. Martinez, the retired welder whose hands shook from decades of arc flash, called out with a voice that cracked. Mark, you've given all of us faith that ordinary people can still do extraordinary things. Lisa from the corner grocery pushed forward, tears streaming. My son has cerebral palsy. I gave up hope. But today, Mark, can you help my son? Mark looked at the faces surrounding him, neighbors who'd known him through loss and struggle, who'd watched him raise Emma alone, who'd heard him working through the night and understood even when they called him crazy. He hadn't prepared for this, had only wanted to help one person because of a promise to a brother who was gone. But now an entire community was placing their faith in him, and in his chest where exhaustion lived, something else stirred. Purpose beyond grief. The celebration continued for hours, but eventually the crowd dispersed and evening settled over San Diego with the kind of golden light that made everything feel significant. Mark sat on an overturned bucket, too tired to move, watching Emma and Sienna talk animatedly about school and dreams and futures that had seemed impossible that morning. Tori approached with 2 bottles of water, handing one over. You should know what you've done here. It's going to attract attention. Not all of it good. Mark took a long drink. I haven't thought past today. Well, you should start, because if Medicor finds out their $180,000 device was outperformed by a mechanic in a garage, they're going to have opinions. Let them have opinions. Mark's voice carried steel beneath the exhaustion. I kept my promise. Everything else is just noise. But noise had a way of becoming deafening. 2 weeks passed. Sienna came to the garage daily, training with Mark, each session building strength and confidence. She walked for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. The pain that had been her constant companion faded to memory, replaced by the simple miracle of movement without suffering. The story spread through networks that had nothing to do with press releases or official channels. Patients at hospitals saw Sienna walking and asked questions. Doctors heard about a girl who'd been wheelchair-bound for 11 years suddenly mobile. Physical therapists whispered about a mechanic who'd designed something that shouldn't have worked but did. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, official and threatening in its corporate letterhead. Mark opened the thick envelope with hands that had learned not to shake, reading words that should have terrified him, but somehow didn't. Legal notice, dear Mr. Marcus Sullivan, we have been informed that you have unlawfully modified a Medicor Model M7 medical device without medical or biomedical engineering license. This action violates FDA regulations governing Class II medical devices. We hereby demand that you immediately cease all activities related to medical devices. Failure to comply will result in civil and criminal legal action. Response deadline, 7 days. David Preston, CEO, Medicor Orthotics. Emma read over his shoulder, sounding out the complicated words. Are they going to sue you, Dad? Maybe. Very likely, sweetheart. The California Orthopedic Association issued a statement that same afternoon, carefully worded but clear in its implications. While they sympathized with the Ashford family's situation, unauthorized modification of medical devices by unlicensed individuals posed significant risks to public safety. They urged regulatory authorities to investigate and take appropriate action. Dr. Henderson received a call from the association's president that evening. The conversation was brief and pointed. Henderson sat in his car afterward, staring at his phone, at the video someone had sent him of Sienna walking freely for the first time in 11 years. The president's words echoed in his memory. If you publicly support this mechanic, you'll lose your medical license. Is that really worth it? Henderson didn't know, but he knew what he'd witnessed in that garage was something his 30 years of practice had never produced. Tori called Mark that night, her voice carrying a determination he'd learned to recognize. Mr. Sullivan, we need to talk. I'm organizing a press conference tomorrow. I'm not going to let them destroy you. Mrs. Ashford, you don't have to. Yes, I do. You saved my daughter. Now I'm going to save you. Mark wanted to argue, to say that drawing more attention would only make things worse, that he'd be fine handling this quietly. But he recognized in Tori's voice the same stubborn refusal to quit that had driven him through 7 days of rebuilding a brace that everyone said couldn't work. Sometimes he was learning, accepting help wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the only path forward. The next morning, Mark stood in his garage surrounded by the evidence of what he'd accomplished. The brace that had worked where money and credentials had failed. The designs that had come from textbooks and YouTube videos rather than MIT classrooms. The proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they refused to believe in limitations. Emma appeared beside him with her backpack, ready for school, but unwilling to leave without saying something. Dad, whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Even if I go to jail, especially if you go to jail. Emma's face carried the kind of certainty that made grown men weep. Because it means you tried to help people even when it was dangerous. That's what heroes do. Mark pulled his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and innocence and faith that he'd spent 7 years trying to deserve. I love you, sweetheart. I know. Now go do what Uncle Ryan would want you to do. Don't let them scare you into stopping. After Emma left for school, Mark sat alone in the garage that had become something more than just a workplace. It was a laboratory, a chapel, a battlefield where ordinary skills had fought extraordinary problems and somehow impossibly won. Whatever came next, lawsuits, regulations, professional outrage, couldn't erase what had happened here. Couldn't take back the moment when Sienna had walked without pain, or the look on Tori's face when 11 years of guilt finally released its grip. The phone rang, Tori again, speaking fast. Press conference is at 2 o'clock. Downtown Sheraton. Be there if you can, but don't feel obligated. I'm doing this regardless. What are you going to say? The truth. That credentials didn't help my daughter, but kindness did. That sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. That they can sue you, but they can't make me stop telling everyone who'll listen that you're a hero, not a criminal. Mark felt something break loose in his chest, the same way it had when Emma had told him to use her school money. People kept believing in him despite every reason not to, kept offering help he didn't know how to accept, kept insisting he mattered when he'd spent years believing his only value came through the work of his hands. Mrs. Ashford, I don't know how to thank you. Then don't. Just keep helping people. That's thanks enough. After she hung up, Mark stood in the garage doorway watching traffic pass on the street outside, the working-class neighborhood he'd never left, the place where dreams went to die practical deaths. Except sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they transformed into something better than the original version, tempered by failure and loss into a strength that looked like weakness until tested. Ryan's voice echoed in memory. Promise me you won't give up. I haven't, brother, and I won't. Whatever storm was coming, Mark Sullivan would face it the same way he'd faced everything since Claire died, with stubborn refusal to quit, with the support of people who believed in him, and with the knowledge that keeping promises mattered more than staying safe. The afternoon sun angled through the garage door, illuminating dust motes that danced like small miracles. And somewhere in the space between past and future, between failure and triumph, a mechanic prepared to defend the impossible thing he'd accomplished through nothing more than skill, faith, and the refusal to accept that some people couldn't be helped. The downtown Sheraton conference room filled with reporters 30 minutes before the scheduled start, cameras jockeying for position, while journalists who'd covered everything from city council meeting to celebrity scandals tried to understand why a biotech billionaire had called an emergency press conference about medical devices. The speculation ran from product recalls to FDA investigations, but nobody guessed the truth because the truth was too strange to predict. Mark arrived 20 minutes early, wearing the only button-down shirt he owned that didn't have grease stains, feeling like an imposter in a world where people spoke in press releases and measured success by how many times their name appeared in headlines. He stood in the back, hoping to remain invisible, but Tori spotted him immediately and waved him forward. You should be up here with us. This is your show, Mrs. Ashford. I'm just the guy who built something. You're the reason we're here. That makes you part of this whether you want to be or not. The cameras began their mechanical chorus at precisely 2 o'clock, flashes creating artificial lightning as Tori stepped to the microphone. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Mark's truck, but her face carried none of the corporate polish that usually marked these events. This was a mother speaking, not a CEO. My name is Victoria Ashford. 11 years ago, my daughter Sienna was in a surfing accident that doctors said would leave her wheelchair-bound for life. For 11 years, I spent over $2 million on the best medical expertise in the world. And for 11 years, my daughter lived in pain. The room had gone completely still. That particular silence that arrives when people realize they're hearing something that matters. 3 weeks ago, a man with no medical degree, working in a garage that barely has running water, did what millions of dollars and decades of expertise could not. He helped my daughter walk. Tori gestured, and Sienna emerged from the side door. Not in a wheelchair, not with assistance, just walking, steady and sure, crossing the small stage to stand beside her mother. The cameras erupted into a frenzy of clicking shutters and whirring motors, documenting the impossible made manifest. A reporter in the front row found his voice first. Ms. Ashford, are you saying an unlicensed individual modified your daughter's medical device? I'm saying that credentials didn't help my daughter walk. Heart and talent did. For 11 years, experts with degrees from MIT told me to accept my daughter's limitations. They were wrong. Another reporter jumped in. But isn't this dangerous? Allowing unqualified people to modify medical equipment? Tori's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been grief finally finding its voice. Dangerous? You know what's dangerous? 11 years of pain, 11 years of watching my daughter cry herself to sleep because the device that cost more than most houses hurt her every time she moved. That's dangerous. That's what your qualified experts provided. Sienna stepped forward then, voice clear despite the tremor of nervousness. My name is Sienna Ashford. I'm 19 years old. For 11 years, I lived in pain, not because I lacked money or access to the best doctors. I lived in pain because people with credentials forgot I was human. They designed devices for engineering perfection, for sensor technology, for appearance, but They forgot that I'm a person who just wanted to walk to the mailbox without crying. She paused, looking directly into the primary camera. Mr. Sullivan treated me like a human being first and an engineering problem second, and he gave me my life back. Please don't punish him for caring. A reporter Mark didn't recognize raised his hand. But Mr. Sullivan violated FDA regulations. Doesn't the law matter? The law exists to protect people like my daughter. Tori's voice cut through the murmur that had started. But when the law prevents the very protection it's supposed to provide, something is broken. And it's not Mr. Sullivan. The press conference lasted 40 minutes, every second captured and uploaded to platforms that would carry the story to millions of people within hours. Mark watched from the back, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that sometimes staying silent meant letting others control the narrative. And this narrative mattered too much to surrender. Afterward, in the hotel service elevator, because Mark couldn't handle being trapped in the main one with reporters still shouting questions, Tori turned to him with exhaustion written across her face. That should buy us some time. Public opinion matters, even to bureaucrats, or it might make them double down just to prove they're not influenced by emotion. Maybe. But at least now people know what's at stake. The video went viral in ways that defied prediction. Within 24 hours, 5 million views. Within 48, it had crossed 15 million and spawned response videos, commentary from medical professionals who'd never heard of Mark Sullivan, and debate segments on news channels that normally covered politics and natural disasters. The comments section became a battlefield between those who believed credentials mattered more than results and those who'd been failed by the medical system enough times to root for the underdog. Medicore's response came swiftly and professionally, delivered by CEO David Preston in a press conference that felt choreographed to emphasize authority and minimize compassion. Preston stood at a podium flanked by lawyers, his silver hair and expensive suit projecting competence that brooked no argument. We sympathize with the Ashford family, truly. But law is law. Mr. Sullivan violated FDA regulations designed to protect public safety. If we allow this precedent, we open the door to unqualified individuals harming patients. Medicare has a responsibility to uphold standards that keep people safe. He showed footage of medical device failures, pacemakers that malfunction, implants that broke, braces that cause injuries worse than the original condition. None of them had anything to do with Mark's work, but the implication was clear. This is what happens when amateurs interfere. The California Orthopedic Association held an emergency board meeting, voting by narrow margin to support legal action against Mark. Dr. Henderson attended, but refused to vote, sitting in silence while colleagues argued about protecting the profession's integrity. Afterward, he sat alone in his car, replaying the video of Sienna walking, comparing it to 11 years of consultations where he'd told Tori to accept reality. What have we become? He whispered the question to an empty vehicle, but the answer felt too large and uncomfortable to acknowledge. Mark's garage became a pilgrimage site for families who'd run out of options and money. They appeared at dawn with children in wheelchairs, with elderly parents whose arthritis had stolen their independence, with hope that bordered on desperation. Mark wanted to help all of them, but knew that desire alone didn't equal ability. I can't. He spoke the words to a mother whose son had cerebral palsy, feeling each syllable like a physical blow. I don't have the training, the resources, the legal protection. If I hurt your son, I could go to prison. And more importantly, he could be damaged worse than he already is. But you helped that girl. The mother's voice carried accusation and pleading in equal measure. I got lucky. Mark hated admitting it, but honesty mattered more than ego. I got lucky that Sienna's condition was something mechanical support could address. Not every injury works that way. He turned away families who needed help he couldn't provide, and each refusal felt like betraying Ryan's memory. But making promises he couldn't keep would betray it worse. Tori hired a legal team despite Mark's protests, corporate lawyers who charged rates that made his head spin and spoke in language that turned simple concepts into incomprehensible jargon. They prepared motions, gathered expert witnesses, built a defense that relied on sympathetic presentation and public pressure rather than legal precedent. You should know, the lead attorney informed Mark during a strategy session that felt like theater rehearsal. We're not going to win on the law. FDA regulations are clear. You violated them. Our only hope is making them decide that prosecuting you creates worse optics than granting an exception. So we're hoping bureaucrats care more about public opinion than rules. We're hoping they're human beings capable of recognizing that sometimes rules need exceptions. Mark wasn't optimistic about human nature in large institutions, but he'd learned that betting against hope was the fastest way to ensure defeat. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday evening after the garage had closed, knocking on the side door that only neighbors used. Mark answered to find an Asian woman in her late 40s, professional but approachable, carrying a briefcase that looked well used rather than decorative. "Mr. Sullivan? I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I teach biomedical engineering at Stanford." Mark's first instinct was suspicion. Another expert here to explain why his work was dangerous and irresponsible. "If you're here to lecture me about credentials, I've heard it already." Chen shook her head, something like sadness crossing her face. "I'm here because I want to examine the brace, if you'll let me." The request was strange enough to be genuine. Mark led her to the workbench where the brace rested between uses, watching as Chen set down her briefcase and pulled out instruments he recognized from YouTube videos about materials testing. She worked in silence for 30 minutes, measuring joint angles, testing flexibility, running her fingers along seams where different materials met. Mark waited, refusing to fill the silence with nervous conversation. If she had something to say, she'd say it. Finally, Chen removed her glasses and wiped eyes that had gone damp. When she spoke, her voice carried weight that had nothing to do with professional authority. 20 years ago, my younger sister was in a car accident. Similar injury to Sienna's. Incomplete spinal cord damage. Doctors who said she'd never walk independently. We tried everything. Every specialist, every device, every treatment that insurance would cover, and several it wouldn't. Nothing worked. She took her own life at 28 because living in constant pain felt worse than not living at all. I'm sorry, the words felt inadequate but necessary. I became a biomedical engineer because of her. Chen replaced her glasses, voice steadying. I've spent 2 decades trying to create a device that could have helped her. And you, she gestured at the brace, you did it in weeks, with no formal training, using principles so elegant I'm ashamed I never considered them. Mark didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Chen continued, pulling documents from her briefcase. I've run comprehensive analysis. This design isn't just safe, it's superior to anything currently on the market. The dynamic balance system, the hip-centered load distribution, the way you've accounted for muscle atrophy and compensatory movement patterns. It's brilliant, and I'm going to testify to that at your FDA hearing. You don't have to do that. My colleagues will be angry. Chen cut him off. But I don't care. If the medical establishment sues you for doing what we failed to do, then the establishment needs to be challenged. I'll testify, and I'll do it under oath with data that can't be dismissed as emotional response. Mark felt something shift, the loneliness of his fight suddenly less absolute. Why? You don't know me. This could cost you professionally. Because my sister deserves someone like you, and she didn't get one. Because letting fear of professional consequences prevent progress is exactly how we ended up with devices that prioritize engineering elegance over human need. And because, Chen's voice softened, because I've spent 20 years living with the guilt of not being able to save her. If I can help save someone like you from being destroyed for doing what I couldn't, maybe that's worth the cost. They worked together through the night, Chen explaining the technical language that would carry weight in bureaucratic settings, while Mark demonstrated the mechanical principles that made his design work. By dawn, they'd created a presentation that translated intuitive understanding into formal analysis, complete with data Chen had gathered using equipment borrowed from Stanford's engineering lab. The FDA hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and those 14 days passed with the strange compression of time that happens when something inevitable approaches. Mark continued his regular work, fixing engines and accepting no new medical cases despite mounting pressure. Emma returned to school but became minor celebrity among classmates who'd seen her father on television, which she handled with grace that made Mark proud and heartbroken in equal measure. She shouldn't have to defend me to her friends. She doesn't have to. Emma looked up from homework that involved fractions she'd mastered weeks earlier. She wants to, because you're her dad and you did something good. That's not complicated. The hearing took place in a federal building downtown, In a room designed to intimidate through institutional authority, high ceilings, portraits of former directors watching with stern disapproval, a panel table elevated above the floor where Mark sat with his public defender who'd been honest about their chances. "We're going to lose on the technical merits," the defender's voice carried resignation born of too many impossible cases. "But sometimes losing is about minimizing damage rather than avoiding it entirely." Mark nodded, accepting that this was a battle he'd known was coming since the moment Sienna's blood had stained his garage floor. The panel consisted of 5 FDA officials, ranging from career bureaucrats to medical professionals borrowed from universities for their expertise. They looked down at Mark with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility, and the lead official, a woman named Dr. Patricia Walsh, whose credentials filled half a page, opened the proceedings with formality that felt like a weapon. "This hearing concerns violations of CFR Title 21 regulations regarding modification of Class II medical devices by unlicensed individuals. Mr. Marcus Sullivan, you are accused of modifying a Medicor Model M7 orthotic brace without proper medical credentials or authorization. How do you plead?" "Guilty." Mark's voice came out steadier than expected. "I modified the brace. I'm not a doctor. I knew it was against regulations when I did it." The admission seemed to surprise everyone, including his own attorney. Walsh's eyebrows raised slightly. "You admit to knowingly violating federal law?" "I do, but I'd do it again if someone needed help, and I thought I could provide it." A murmur ran through the gallery, where reporters and medical professionals had gathered to watch expertise defend itself against audacity. Medicor's legal team, led by a lawyer whose suit probably cost more than Mark made in 6 months, looked pleased at the easy admission. "Your Honor," Medicor's lawyer stood with practiced authority, "the defendant has confessed to violating regulations designed to protect public safety. Regardless of outcome in this particular case, allowing such violations to go unpunished sets a dangerous precedent. Anyone could claim good intentions while causing irreparable harm. The law exists for a reason, and that reason is the protection of vulnerable patients from well-meaning but unqualified individuals." He proceeded to call expert witnesses, doctors from prestigious hospitals, who explained in careful detail why medical device design required years of training, engineers from MIT who outlined the testing protocols Mark had bypassed, statisticians who calculated the probability of success being offset by risk of catastrophic failure. Each one built a wall of expertise that made Mark's achievement seem less like genius and more like dangerous luck. Dr. Samuel Bradford from Johns Hopkins spoke with the authority of someone whose opinion had never been questioned in professional settings. "While we're pleased with the positive outcome for Miss Ashford, the process was fundamentally reckless. Without proper testing protocols, Mr. Sullivan couldn't have known if the device was safe. He succeeded despite his methods, not because of them. The next person who tries this might not be so fortunate, and a patient could die." The argument was reasonable, logical, built on foundations that couldn't be easily dismissed. Mark watched his defense crumble under the weight of institutional knowledge. Understanding that expertise and credentials existed for legitimate reasons, that his success didn't invalidate the value of formal training. Then Chen stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, professor of biomedical engineering at Stanford. I've spent the last 10 days analyzing Mr. Sullivan's device in detail, running tests that meet or exceed industry standards. I'm here to testify that his design is not only safe, it's superior to existing solutions." Medicor's lawyer objected immediately. She wasn't on the witness list. Dr. Walsh considered, then overruled. "Dr. Chen's credentials are impeccable. We'll hear her testimony." Chen approached the panel table with materials that transformed mechanical intuition into academic language, data that proved what Mark had understood through feel and observation. She showed stress analysis, wear testing, comparison studies between Mark's brace and Medicor's offering. The numbers told a story that couldn't be dismissed as emotion or luck. The Medicor device follows an outdated paradigm, immobilization to protect. Mr. Sullivan's design follows a different approach, dynamic support to enable. The difference isn't just philosophical, it's measurable. His brace distributes load more evenly, reduces compensatory stress by 40%, and allows natural range of motion that existing devices prevent. One of the panel members, a doctor whose nameplate identified him as Dr. Robert Kim, leaned forward with genuine interest. But Dr. Chen, are you saying the Medicor device was poorly designed? I'm saying it was designed according to principles that prioritize structural integrity over functional movement. It's not that the engineers were incompetent, they were solving for the wrong problem. Chen pulled out a document that made every lawyer in the room tense. I obtained internal Medicor emails through Freedom of Information Act requests, emails showing that engineers flagged problems with the M7 design 3 years before Miss Ashford received her brace. Specifically, concerns about the fixed knee angle causing hip strain and chronic back pain in patients. The room erupted into chaos, panel members calling for order while Medicor's legal team tried to object and reporters scribbled frantically. Chen waited for silence, then continued with the dispassion of someone presenting data rather than accusations. Management's response, as documented in these emails, was that redesign would be too expensive and impact quarterly earnings. They chose to delay addressing known design flaws until the next model year, which means Medicor knew their device caused pain, chose profit over patience, and are now suing the man who fixed their mistake. David Preston, Medicor's CEO, stood from the gallery. Those emails are out of context, are they? Chen turned to face him directly. Because they're dated 2 years before Miss Ashford received her brace. 2 years during which Medicor continued selling a device they knew caused chronic pain. Would you like to explain that context? Preston had no answer that wouldn't make things worse, so he said nothing and sat down. Walsh called a recess, and Mark sat in a small conference room with his attorney who looked shell-shocked by Chen's testimony. I've never seen anything like that. Where did she get those emails? Chen answered from the doorway, where she'd appeared without invitation. FOIA requests take months, but I have good relationships with people who process them quickly when I explain why the information matters. And those emails were flagged for potential patient safety issues, which made them accessible. You destroyed their entire case. The attorney's voice carried something between admiration and fear. But you also made powerful enemies. Good. Chen's expression held no regret. Some enemies are worth making. When the hearing reconvened, Walsh allowed Mark to make a statement. He stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and spoke words he'd been composing since the day Sienna first walked without pain. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a doctor. I'm a mechanic who learned from books because I made a promise to my brother that I'd help people like him if I ever got the chance. I knew modifying the brace violated regulations. I did it anyway because a 19-year-old girl was in pain, and I thought I could help. He paused, looking at each panel member individually. If that makes me a criminal, I accept that judgment. But I won't apologize for helping someone who needed it. And I won't stop helping people just because the law says I need credentials I don't have time to earn before they run out of hope. The silence that followed felt heavier than any verdict. Then Sienna stood from the gallery, her mother trying to hold her back, but Sienna shaking free. She walked forward, steady, confident, moving with the ease that 11 years of wheelchairs and pain had stolen, and faced the panel with courage that made her seem older than 19. My name is Sienna Ashford. For 11 years, I lived with pain that credentials couldn't fix. Millions of dollars couldn't fix it. The best doctors in the world couldn't fix it. But Mr. Sullivan fixed it in 2 weeks, using nothing but determination and kindness. If you punish him for helping me, you're telling every other patient like me that we don't matter as much as regulations, that our suffering is acceptable if it protects institutional authority. She took 3 steps forward, movements that would have been impossible before Mark's intervention. Please don't punish him. Please don't tell people like me that hope is illegal. Walsh called for a 2-hour recess while the panel deliberated. Mark spent it in the hallway, surrounded by Emma and Mrs. Martinez and neighbors who'd driven downtown to support him. Tori and Sienna sat nearby. The distance between their world and Mark's world collapsed through shared crisis. Emma held his hand, saying nothing because there was nothing to say that her presence didn't already communicate. The panel returned with faces that revealed nothing. Walsh read from a prepared statement, voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating political minefields. In the matter of FDA versus Marcus Sullivan, this panel finds that Mr. Sullivan did violate CFR Title 21 regulations regarding medical device modification. However, we also find that current regulatory frameworks may be insufficient for addressing innovative approaches that fall outside traditional pathways. Mark braced himself for the hammer to fall. Therefore, the panel's decision is as follows. Mr. Sullivan will receive a conditional special license, allowing him to design orthopedic devices under the direct supervision of Dr. Sarah Chen. The license is valid for 2 years, during which time Mr. Sullivan must complete formal biomedical engineering certification. Upon completion of certification, the license becomes permanent. Failure to complete certification or any violation of supervisory requirements will result in immediate revocation and potential criminal charges. The courtroom erupted, but Mark heard none of it through the ringing in his ears. He'd expected punishment, imprisonment, the destruction of everything he'd built. Instead, they'd given him permission to continue, structured permission wrapped in requirements and supervision, but permission nonetheless. Chen appeared beside him, hand on his shoulder. Congratulations, you just changed the industry. I just wanted to help one person. Well, you're going to help a lot more than that now, whether you're ready or not. 18 months later, Mark stood in the lobby of the Sullivan Mobility Center, watching morning light stream through windows that overlooked San Diego Bay. The building wasn't luxurious. Tori had wanted to fund something grander, but Mark had insisted on modest. But it was filled with equipment that transformed lives and staffed by people who understood that expertise mattered less than compassion combined with competence. The sign above the door read, Sullivan Mobility Center, Making Hope Walk Again, with a smaller plaque beneath dedicating the facility to Ryan Sullivan, whose death had planted seeds that grew into salvation for others. Opening day brought families lined up before dawn, parents carrying children whose conditions ranged from cerebral palsy to traumatic injuries, elderly patients whose arthritis had stolen independence, veterans whose service had left them broken in ways that normal medicine couldn't address. Mark greeted each person by kneeling to their level, asking the same question that had started everything. Can you show me how you're able to move right now? Sienna worked as a physical therapy assistant, combining her experience as a patient with training she'd completed while finishing her degree in rehabilitation science. She welcomed families with the particular understanding that only someone who'd lived through suffering could offer. Sharing her story not to boast, but to demonstrate that miracles were real if people refused to surrender. Emma, now 8.5, helped her father in the workshop after school, drawing designs that grew more sophisticated as her understanding deepened. She asked questions that sometimes revealed insights Mark had missed, approaching problems with the fresh perspective of someone not yet trained to think in established patterns. Would Uncle Ryan be proud of you, Dad? Mark pulled his daughter close, tears falling without shame or apology. He would be very proud, sweetheart. Chen divided her time between Stanford and the center, teaching Mark formal engineering while learning from him the intuitive understanding that no classroom could provide. Their collaboration produced designs that combined academic rigor with practical wisdom, devices that worked because they addressed human needs rather than engineering elegance. Tori visited weekly, her relationship with Sienna transformed from guilt-laden obligation to genuine partnership between mother and daughter, who'd both learned that forgiveness couldn't be purchased, but could be earned through vulnerability and trust. They walked together along beaches that once held only trauma, reclaiming spaces that suffering had poisoned. One afternoon, with gentle waves lapping at their feet, Sienna turned to her mother with a question that had waited years for safe territory to ask. Mom, do you still feel guilty when you look at me? Tori considered the honest answer rather than the comfortable lie. Sometimes, but not like before. Before, the guilt was about what I failed to do. Now, when I feel it, it's about making sure I don't fail you going forward. Different kind of guilt. Healthier, maybe. You didn't fail me, Mom. You gave me the chance to try something everyone else said wouldn't work. That's not failing. That's being brave enough to trust. They embraced while standing in surf that had once represented the worst moment of both their lives, and the ocean felt like water again, rather than an enemy that stole futures. In 6 months, the center had helped 43 patients regain mobility they'd been told was permanently lost. Not all of them walked without assistance, not all achieved complete independence, but each one found improvement that credentials had declared impossible. Mark documented every case meticulously, building evidence that innovation mattered as much as tradition, that expertise could come from unexpected sources if combined with genuine desire to help. Dr. Henderson visited on a Saturday morning, unannounced and uncomfortable, carrying the particular awkwardness of someone acknowledging they'd been wrong. He watched Mark work with a 10-year-old boy whose congenital condition had left him wheelchair-bound, observing how Mark combined mechanical adjustment with encouragement that transformed physical therapy into something approaching hope. When the session ended, Henderson approached with hesitation that suggested this visit had required courage. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Sullivan. I doubted you. I nearly helped destroy you. And I was wrong about almost everything. You were trying to protect your profession." Mark understood that protecting things we've dedicated our lives to wasn't weakness. It was human nature. "Can't fault you for that. But I should have been trying to protect patients instead." Henderson's voice carried the weight of someone recognizing how far they drifted from original purpose. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and somewhere along the way I forgot that credentials are tools, not destinations. You reminded me what actually matters." He extended his hand, and Mark shook it, accepting the apology as genuine even if it came later than it should have. The evening before what would have been Ryan's 34th birthday, Mark took Emma to Pacific Beach, and they sat on sand still warm from afternoon sun, watching colors bleed across the sky in ways that made sadness and beauty indistinguishable. "Do you think Uncle Ryan knows what you did?" Emma's question carried the seriousness that children bring to matters of life and death, unfiltered by adult discomfort with uncertainty. "I think if any part of him still exists somewhere, he knows. And I think he'd tell me I'm spending too much time at the center and not enough time with you." Emma leaned against her father's shoulder, small and solid and impossibly brave. "I don't mind. You're helping people like you wanted to help him. That's important. You're important too, sweetheart. You're the reason I kept going when giving up would have been easier, I know." Emma's voice carried the confidence of a child who'd never doubted being loved. "That's what dads do. They keep going even when it's hard, just like Uncle Ryan taught you." Mark pulled his daughter close and watched the sun sink toward the horizon, thinking about promises kept and promises still being fulfilled, about the way ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things if they refused to believe in limitations that existed only because everyone agreed to accept them. Somewhere in the darkening sky, Ryan's voice seemed to echo across the years, not haunting, but celebrating. "You did good, brother. You did real good." The Sullivan Mobility Center celebrated its first anniversary on a Saturday in October, and the event drew families whose lives had been transformed through the combination of mechanical expertise and stubborn compassion. They gathered in the parking lot converted to celebration space, sharing food and stories and the particular joy that comes from witnessing miracles become ordinary through repetition. Mark stood at the edge of the crowd, overwhelmed by what had grown from a promise made in a hospital room to a dying brother. He'd expected to help one person, maybe two, if he was lucky. Instead, he'd helped dozens and trained others to help dozens more, creating ripples that would extend far beyond his own efforts. Tori found him in his moment of solitude, holding a glass of wine she'd brought, knowing he'd never get himself one. "You changed my daughter's life. You know that, right? I gave her different brace. You gave her everything else, the courage to trust, the resources to access care, the determination to keep trying when giving up would have been easier." Tori shook her head, smiling. "No, I gave her money and guilt. You gave her hope. Those aren't the same thing." They stood together, watching Sienna play with Emma and other children in the converted parking lot, two women from such different worlds that their friendship shouldn't have been possible. Yet here they were, united by shared crisis and the understanding that suffering recognizes no class boundaries. The final scene played out on Pacific Beach as the sun descended toward the Pacific Ocean in colors that seemed too vivid to be real, but were just California being itself. Mark and Emma, Tori and Sienna stood on sand where trauma had occurred and healing had begun, and Sienna made a decision that felt both brave and necessary. "I want to go in the water." Tori's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I'm not afraid anymore." Sienna's voice carried conviction born of confronting what had broken her and discovering she was stronger than the breaking. "I want to feel the ocean again without it being the thing that hurt me." She walked toward the surf, moving with the confidence that proper support had restored, and when the first wave washed over her feet, she laughed. Genuine, joyful, the sound of someone reclaiming stolen territory. Tori ran to join her daughter, and they stood together in shallow water that had once represented the worst day of both their lives. "Mom, I can feel it." Sienna's joy was infectious, spreading to her mother, whose tears were no longer about guilt, but about witnessing resurrection. "I can feel the water, and it doesn't hurt." They embraced while waves broke around them, and the ocean became just water again. Not an enemy, not a source of trauma, but the natural force it had always been before fear, char, and suffering rewrote its meaning. Mark watched from the beach, Emma beside him, both of them understanding that some moments were too sacred to interrupt with presence. "Are you happy, Dad?" "Very happy, sweetheart." "Because you kept your promise to Uncle Ryan?" Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face in the California sunset. "Yes. And because I learned that keeping promises sometimes means accepting help from people brave enough to believe in you. Your uncle taught me not to give up, but you and Mrs. Martinez and Dr. Chen and even Mrs. Ashford, you all taught me that fighting alone isn't the same as fighting well." Emma wrapped her arms around her father's waist. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not because you're famous or because you change things. I'm proud because you're you, and you help people even when it's scary." The four of them walked together back to Mark's truck as darkness settled over San Diego, and the city lights began their nightly performance of pretending stars weren't unreachable. They passed families playing on the beach, couples walking hand in hand, the ordinary magic of people living lives that seemed small, until you remembered that every life contained universes of meaning that couldn't be measured in credentials or bank accounts. The drive home took them through neighborhoods Mark had never left, past the garage where everything had started, through streets where hope had seemed like a luxury rather than a necessity. But hope, he'd learned, wasn't something you bought or earned. It was something you chose when all the reasonable evidence suggested choosing otherwise. Mrs. Martinez was waiting on her porch as Mark pulled up, because neighbors who'd known you through everything didn't stop watching just because the crisis had passed. She waved and Mark waved back, and the simple gesture contained all the gratitude that more elaborate thanks could never capture. Inside the small house above the garage, Emma went to bed clutching the mechanical puppet Mark had built for her birthday, now joined by a dozen other creations that populated her shelf like a museum of her father's love expressed through gears and joints. Mark tucked her in, kissing her forehead the way he had every night since Claire died. "Love you, Dad. Love you too, sweetheart. Thanks for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's what family does." Emma's eyes were already closing, exhaustion from a day filled with celebration pulling her towards sleep. "We believe in each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Mark turned off the light and stood in the doorway, watching his daughter sleep, thinking about all the ways life breaks people and all the ways broken people can rebuild themselves if they refuse to accept that broken is the same as finished. He thought about Ryan and Claire and all the people he'd lost, about Sienna and Emma and all the people he'd found, about the strange mathematics of grief where loss never really subtracts, but somehow, impossibly, creates space for different kinds of love to grow. The garage below held tools that had been his father's and would someday be Emma's if she wanted them, a chain of knowledge passed through generations not in classrooms, but in the patient demonstration of how to fix things that the world said were beyond repair. He'd learned from books and videos, in bitter experience, that sometimes the most important expertise was knowing you didn't know everything, but trying anyway because trying mattered more than certainty. Ryan's photograph sat on the workbench, a young man frozen at 29, with his whole life still ahead of him in the picture, even though the future had run out years ago. Mark picked Ob's frame, studying his brother's face, seeing in it the echo of Emma's features and his own. "I kept my promise, brother. And I'll keep it forever." The night settled over San Diego like a blanket or a blessing, depending on which metaphor fit your theology. And in the space between sleeping and waking, between past and future, between what was lost and what was found, a mechanic who'd never wanted to be anything more than good at fixing things discovered he'd become someone who fixed more than machines. He'd fixed hope. He'd fixed faith. He'd fixed the particular kind of despair that comes from being told your suffering is acceptable because changing it would violate somebody's regulations. And if that made him a criminal in the eyes of bureaucracy, well, he'd been called worse things by better people. And none of it changed the fact that ordinary skill combined with extraordinary stubbornness could still change the world one person at a time. The lights went out in the house above the garage, and San Diego continued its nightly business of being a city where dreams went to or transform, where the Pacific Ocean crashed against shores that held both tragedy and redemption, where a mechanic slept peacefully, knowing he'd kept a promise to a dead brother and helped a living girl walk again. And those two things were actually the same accomplishment expressed in different grammar.